The business of culture, the culture of business, entrepreneurs, policy, media, startups, misfits, what else? Full disclosure, I'm Stewart in for Roben Farzad. My guest today is an icon of 80s music with hits like She Blinded Me with Science, Europa and the Pirate Twins, Hyperactive, and so much more. But Thomas Dolby is much more than the mad scientist character he created in many of those videos. He's a producer, a filmmaker, an author, a professor, and a tech innovator. Thomas Dolby, welcome to Full Disclosure with me, Ian Stewart, in for Roben Farzad, who has a question for you later about part of your career. But I want to thank you for joining me today. I'm so excited to talk to you because I've been a fan of yours since your first album, back in 1981, 1982. So thank you for joining me on Full Disclosure.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Ian. Nice to be here.
Nice to meet you. Where are you right now? I could tell you're maybe in your kitchen or someplace, but where in the world are you?
I'm in Baltimore, Maryland, which is where I reside during the academic year, because as you probably know, I'm a professor at Peabody Institute, which is part of Johns Hopkins University. I teach music there.
All right. That is also one of my questions. I'm going to start with, you were quite the Renaissance man. You're a musician, a professor, as mentioned, an inventor, an author, which I can't wait to talk to you about that. How do you define yourself?
I suppose, a polyglot, really. I like trying things that I suck at because I'm basically a show off and I won't put anything out there for the public until I've become an expert. So it sort of forces me to learn new skills. And I love the creative process. I'm just most happy when I'm being creative. But if it's in a field where I don't really know what the heck I'm doing, then it makes it that much more stimulating and challenging to me than, reverting to formulas that have worked for me in the past.
Yeah. I think you could see that with your albums too, that you've done over the years in terms of trying different avenues and trying different things. You didn't really hang your coat on, She Blinded Me with Science and your big hits from the golden age of wireless. Take us back to the early days, though. You were a session player for Lena Lovitch. New Toy is one of my favorite songs of all time. I'm a dork. I still have it in rotation because I love it so much. How did that all begin?
Well, I was a member of her band for, I think, a few months. The first professional band I was in was Bruce Woolley and the Camera Club. And we did a tour. Bruce had been an original member of the Buggles. And we put that band together sort of while the Buggles were having international hits with Video Killed the Radio Star. So I was on tour with Bruce as his keyboard player, touring the US, supporting Lena Lovitch's band. And I was very enamored with Lena's music and her stage aura. And so I wrote New Toy for her basically in my hotel room over the course of the tour. And I sent her a tape. And, a few months later, I was approached saying, we're actually playing your song in rehearsal. Why don't you come down? And so we routined it a bit and she decided to record it as a single. And that, was a hit in the UK and a sort of bit of a college hit in the US. And was sort of one of my first brushes with fame, really.
Yeah. Did that give you more of an impetus to think that you could start your own, do your own album and write more of your songs? Was that kind of your first taste of writing your own music?
I mean, I've been writing my own music and making demos for a while, but mostly in my back room using a few drum boxes and machines and a 2-track tape recorder. That was really the first time I'd had an entire song played by a great band. And in fact, I took the rhythm section from Lena's band and a couple of other players, and that was the band that I used on my first album.
Interesting. I guess it's all in who you know. One thing about that time period too that I always found interesting, and a lot of bands seem to have done this. It's the I don't know if it's a yodel or it's an echo, like oh, like that kind of thing seemed to be apparent. No question there. It just you saw it in that. You saw it in XTC songs. You saw it in just a whole bunch of different things. It seemed to be kind of the genre back then to put in a yodel.
Yeah, it was an earworm back in those days, and I suppose these days, there are modern equivalents of the same thing. Um, yeah, they
Yeah.
come and go. They get hackneyed pretty quickly, and then people stop doing them.
Yeah. What's your take on that whole era right now, being where you are in your career and your creative life right now? Do you look back at it with fondness, look back and think, "Oh, like what are your thoughts, with this perspective that you have now?"
Well, I mean, it was a great time. I think music had sort of gotten very bogged down in the mid '70s with sort of progressive rock and corporate sort of the arrival of FM radio and things like that. And punk rock, for my generation, was really a shot in the arm because it sort of proved that anybody could do it. A lot of early electronic artists were sort of like the kid next door. We'd all grown up with glam rock and Roxy music and Bowie and people like that, T-Rex, and when Bowie went to Berlin with Eno and started doing electronic music, that was a signal that you can make hit pop records with all electronic instruments. And then I guess, when Gary Newman, was on Top of the Pops doing it, he wasn't a superstar. He was like the kid next door who had sort of grabbed his hairbrush and was doing some eyeliner and was doing it in the mirror. So it's like, this was very inspiring because it made us think that you can do this sort of DIY thing now and anybody can be a pop star. But it was really busted wide open, I think, really by the arrival of MTV, because right when radio was quite corporate, MTV came along and suddenly hip people were watching videos by people you'd never heard of, like Laurie Anderson or Kate Bush or maybe Peter Gabriel or Buggles or whatever, myself, and were staying home and watching that on a Saturday night instead of going out to clubs and concerts. So radio had to look at the MTV playlists and were getting requests left, right, and center to play those songs. So it sort of broke open the mold of the type of sound of songs that they were willing to program.
Yeah. And with that MTV too, because that was one of my questions, did that had to change your perspective as an artist where you were, a session musician and then creating your own music? Did you have to suddenly turn and think, oh, now I have to create videos? No, that whole time period, there were musicians who either embraced it and said, oh, it's another creative outlet for me, and other ones who were like, I'm just going to put me singing in front of something, and
Well,
or these weird videos like Safety Dance where you're like, what the hell are you doing? So was that another creative outlet for you, or?
I'll give you three guesses as to which side of that fence I was on. No, I was, I'd always fancied myself as a screenwriter, as a filmmaker, but there was no outlet for me. It's like there was no university course I could have gone and done, in London in experimental film or, electronic music. There was nothing like that then. So I left school at 16, to sort of pursue my career. So when MTV came along and suddenly you had this opportunity to make a sort of 3.5 minute, essentially a silent film with a soundtrack, that was great for me. And so what I chose to do with that medium was, I'd always been a fan of silent film stars, like Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, Charlie Chaplin, and they were always the underdog. They weren't the sort of pin-up heroes. They were the cute little guy that dodged the bully and ended up getting the girl anyway out of kindness and so on. And so I identified with that character, at a time when many of my contemporaries were sort of pin-up poster children like, Simon Le Bon and Adam and Ant and Sting and people like that. And I wasn't going to compete with them in the handsome boy stakes, but I was this sort of geeky, dorky, underdog character. So that was what I put forward, in my video.
Yeah, you could see that too in terms of when you look at your track listings on all your albums too. Screen Kiss from the Flat Earth, another kind of film reference on Astronauts and Heretics. Your vision of, I think it's Los Angeles with silk pajamas. I get all these images when I'm listening to it of film, and I can totally see that now.
Yeah, they're very visual. I mean, I often sort of do, like, I imagine scenes from films or from novels as a sort of source of inspiration for my songs. And what I like about film and fiction is that you can have any time period, any geographical setting. You can create these characters and these conflicts. And I really like that as a jumping off point for songs versus the more typical pop sort of conversational, ooh, baby, I love, type choruses. And so, I would sort of start with a blank canvas every time I wrote a song, and I would pick a context, an environment to write it in. And often there are elements from nature, from the planet, weird technological phenomenon, not necessarily the latest, greatest, most high tech, but sometimes old tech, that failed, but there's often this sort of alternative reality, what if scenario, what if steam had taken over rather than electricity, what if the Germans had invaded and won the Second World War, what if in a sort of apocalyptic climate crisis future, it's dangerous to go out because of the acid rain and the raw copper cables in the streets and things like that. And I always imagine myself in a basement somewhere broadcasting on behalf of the resistance,
That makes a lot of sense, with the golden age of wireless, because at the time when that came out, I'm a little younger, not that much younger than you are. I was in high school when that came out and reading Aldous Huxley and George Orwell. And I always now identify Huxley, especially with golden age of wireless and the visions of this apocalyptic kind of world. So it's great to have you kind of, I guess, prove my theory that I'm not weird and thinking like, you're in a basement somewhere and it's the end of the world. You mentioned characters. So your character, Golden Age of Wireless, was, a mad scientist kind of character. Did you feel like you almost got pigeonholed with that? Like, oh no, did the record label say, you got to do more, geeky scientist type of thing? Or did you have to explain to people, no, this is this here and I'm going to do something else later?
And the record industry was still relatively naive in those days. It's like when I first encountered record company types, a lot of them were music fans. They were people who couldn't really believe that they could, get a paycheck for doing the stuff that they loved. It was only really during the course of the 80s that record companies became sort of run more like any other for-profit corporation. And so in the early 80s, my record company, EMI, they didn't really understand me. They didn't really know where the music came from or what made me tick. So was there pressure? Yeah, I think they were disappointed that I didn't follow a formula. And it's like they work so hard to break you through the glass ceiling. And once you're there and you've had a hit record, they sort of expect that you'll follow the tradition of like cookie cuttering out a few more hits, and really get yourself on the map. And I wasn't willing to do that, for reasons that we discussed. I'm just happiest when I'm breaking new ground. It was never really a handicap for me that sort of first album Image was such a success because it opened so many doors for me. It attracted a lot of attention in the industry. I got all sorts of very enticing offers from some of my heroes, to go and work with them, to play synth for them, or to write songs with them or whatever. And so it was a very exciting time, and also things like film industry opening up and so on. So yeah, and I saw it as a springboard more than anything.
Yeah, I think during that time too, with the synthesizers that were going on, I think most bands and musicians like yourself, I think we're able to carve out unique sounds with this instrument. I mean, you have Human League, Gary Newman, as you mentioned, Depeche Mode, all had this kind of heavy synth sound, which was another avenue of new wave in a way. I think it's great that you weren't copying them and you were kind of still doing your own thing. There's no question there. It's more, I'm just a fanboy right now saying like, it was a really cool thing that you did. With your second album, The Flat Earth, though, you mentioned there was some pressure from the record company, but you had some great hits on there with Hyperactive and I Scare Myself. I'm sorry, I have notes. I gotta check. What was the impetus behind that? Did you want to just create a whole new character? Because this one you're mining for gold or something on the picture on the front. Mm-hmm. So what was your mindset going to that album?
It was more organic, I think. The early arrival of electronics in pop music, a lot of people sort of used the inherent coldness of electronics as a thing, So it coincided with the Cold War in Europe. You had a lot of people writing songs like about Vienna or Leipzig or Budapest, or you had Bowie with this sort of being enamored with the burnt out bomb sites in Berlin and things like that. And when you worked with synthesizers have this sort of machine-like way of doing things. And some artists, Kraftwerk are a great example, they really celebrated the quirks of electronic instruments. They didn't try and make them sound like real instruments, real acoustic instruments. But I always saw them as a way for me to sort of indulge my more sort of symphonic approach to sound. It was quite lush. It was quite organic. I was trying to sort of humanize the electronic instruments in some ways and have them sound less like machines, more human, more atmospheric. So yeah, I think with the Flat Earth, that's starting to come about. The other thing, big technological change with the Flat Earth was the arrival of samplers. So I had a Fairlight, which is one of the first samplers in the UK. And there weren't many of them there. Peter Gabriel had one, Kate Bush had one, Trevor Horn had one, Hans Zimmer, I think, had one. There weren't that many people in those days that were lucky enough to, get to experiment with them. And one of the things with samplers is you can sample, a chorus of frogs in the rainforest at night, or you can sample a sheep in a field bleating and play a tune with it, or aspects of the human voice, as well as drums and guitars and strings and things like that. So it suddenly became possible to introduce these variety of sonic elements that were very natural, very human into the sound, not just the cold sound of electronics.
Yeah, you did that too, I believe, on Cloudburst off Golden Age of Wireless. He also did it on Astronauts and Heretics with the sound of thunder. And oh man, I have all the CDs here.
I Love You Goodbye.
Yeah, that just thank you, just great. I love that you reference a Datsun in that song, by the way. So with the flat Earth, what's the meaning behind flat Earth? Now there's a different connotation with people that say flat Earth, but was it just something part of your persona back then, or like where did you come up with the flat Earth reference and want to name it? I think you named kind of your label, or you named your business kind of Flat Earth.
Well, my label was actually called Venice in Peril.
Okay.
The Flat Earth. So there was already a Flat Earth Society, when I came up with that name. And I think it had been around for years. And I just imagined it as the sort of, Victorian gentleman in ill-fitting suits, in a squeaky old, wooden lecture room, putting forward these outlandish theories about how the Earth was actually flat. So I could rather relate to that idea of the sort of, fuddy-duddy, professorial type. Interesting that you say it has a different connotation now, because I think, in this sort of conspiratorial age, you sort of poke fun at people that have these outrageous conspiracy theories that are easily disproved, and so somebody that is willing to carry on believing something that is easily debunked, it's easy, you poke fun at, and so I think it has a different connotation now. But there was the Flat Earth Society actually awarded me the membership number of number 1. Which, and occasionally still on social media, I get somebody sort of trolling me going, dude, you can't seriously believe that. And then they,
Yeah, it's got to be sad, because back then, it was a really cool, quirky thing to do, and like, oh, the flat Earth, like, I was in on a joke, I got it, and now you're like, hey, listen, it's not that way.
I don't find I have to defend myself like that very often. Social media is like 99.9% really nice to me, which is astonishing.
Good. So kind of going back to being a session musician, you've worked with the Thompson twins and so many people. Roben Farzad, who this is his show that I get the guest host, has a question. I'm going to try to play it, so I hope you could hear it. So here's his question for you.
Here, so flattered and honored and stoked to have you on Full Disclosure. I have a couple of fanboy questions, kind of in Song Exploder style. Two songs I'm a huge fan of. Waiting for a Girl Like You, the landmark Foreigner song from the early 80s. And Def Leppard's Photograph. You were asked to play keyboard on both. On the former, it was the haunting beginning to the song. And on the latter, a lot of people don't realize that keyboards were essential, I think, to the guitar background. And you got to work with someone as elusive as Mutt Lang. Can you please tell us about how both experiences came to happen? Thank you.
There you go.
Yeah, so I was actually living in Paris, working as a street musician, as a busker. I would get up every morning and go down the metro and sit on my backside playing Bob Dylan songs, like with a guitar case in front of me, hopefully getting filled up with centimes until I could afford to eat. And I aged 19 or something, and I got a call from a friend in London saying, yeah, Mick Jones is trying to get a hold of you to do a session. I'm like, The Clash, yes. And he said, no, it's a different Mick Jones. And I didn't know much about Foreigner, but the other Mick Jones is a really nice guy, good musician. And it turned out that Mutt Lang, the producer, who was co-owner of a publishing company and recording studio in London called Zomba with some South African colleagues, had heard a tape that I'd sent them when I was looking for a publishing deal, and he really liked the synth playing. And they were approaching the end of the recording of the Foreigner 4 album in New York. They'd put keyboards on the whole album. They weren't very happy with them. And so they invited me to fly over for a couple of days and just sort of try out some ideas. And so I flew, I had to put aside all of my pressing engagements in the Paris metro, for a couple of days and fly to New York. And the first stuff that I did, they liked. And so they said, look, can you stay on for a few days? And it ended up being a month. During the day, they were doing vocals. And at night, they would let me in the studio with a relief engineer to record keyboards. And they'd come back in the morning, and they'd often say, look, you've got these 6 tracks, these 7 tracks that you can use, see what you can dream up. And they had this ballad, right? That I didn't know them as a ballad band. I'd heard their sort of more rocky stuff, but they had this lovely ballad, and it was very simple, but it sort of started with a Fender Rose that just sort of went. Straight into it, right? And I thought, okay, I could actually create something ahead of that. And I imagined this sort of very dreamy, atmospheric thing. I'd always been a big Brian Eno fan, I liked his music for airports and so on. But we didn't have polyphonic synths in those days, so it was not easy to create sort of dreaminess that you can. I had a micro Moog that played one note at a time only. So there's no way I could get dreamy with that. But what I did was, they gave me these tracks to work with. And what I'd read that 10cc used to record vocals where they'd put like a different sound of ooze on each different track. And then they sort of play chords by just using the faders on the mixing board. So I basically did the same with keyboards and created this intro before the song itself came in. And so that was the intro that you're probably familiar with, which sort of sounds something like this. that's basically the sound of me, playing those faders. And the band came in the morning; they really liked it, and then I think they decided they wanted like a bit of a synth intro before the vocals start. I think it's pretty. Mick Jones came up with this line, which sort of little synth, arpeggio thing before the vocal starts. Yeah. So that was that one. All right. So then Mutt Lang also produced the a couple of Def Leppard albums, and he was doing those in London, and he had me come in, and I mean, my contribution is pretty minimal to Def Leppard. He wanted me to sort of basically double some of the guitars with keyboards, to sort of fatten out the sound. So I had to do it a string at a time. So he had the guitarist sort of show me the inversions that he was playing, with the chords, and then I had to pick out each individual string and play, double that note. And I mean, Mutt is an incredible producer, but he's the most annoyingly fastidious man in the world, and drives people crazy. I think with Bryan Adams, it took him 5 months to get a drum sound.
Wow. You produced some stuff too. Another, I think you produced this album, and when I ask you this, if you don't want to talk about this, it's totally fine. But you got to work with Joni Mitchell on Dog Eat Dog, and it's my understanding was not like the greatest experience, and so I totally understand if there's nothing that you want to say about it. But I'm a huge Joni fan, as I think you were with Hissing of Summer Lawns. Great album, Jungle Line. Caetano Velasco's cover of Jungle Line is also a great one. You don't know that. Mm-hmm. Really, really great cover. If you can, what was that experience like? I don't need you to get into the details of like, oh, this and that, but I mean, like just in general, like working with, an icon like Joni Mitchell. What was that whole thing like?
Yeah, well, I'd grown up with her music, long before Hissing of Summer Lawns, but really that album and Hejira were the special ones for me. And Hejira is just sort of, otherworldly, I guess because of the Jacques Pastorius, presence, just the combination they came up with was just fantastic.
You're a huge bass, you're like a huge bass player lover. Because you had Terry Jackson, sadly, who passed away, but Terry Jackson played some great bass for you. So Jacko, go ahead. I'm sorry, but yeah, it's interesting that you call that out.
Yeah, Matthew Seligman also, who's also no longer with us, was a long-term, collaborator. I mean, most of the bass lines on my records are part of the composition. In the case of somebody like Terry, he's such a stylist that a lot of the licks and things he came up with were completely from his own head. But usually the left hand, when I'm playing things on keyboard, is the bass part. And so on something like Screen Kiss, for example, that was my left hand that Matthew matched. So Joni, I mean, it's an incredible honor that she took any notice of me at all. I think she'd heard the Flat Earth. She'd heard production that I'd done with Prefab Sprout. She was looking for a new sound for the Dog Eat Dog album. She had recently married Larry Klein, and he'd acquired a Fairlight. He also is a bass player, by the way. He'd acquired a Fairlight, but didn't really know how to use it yet. And so they decided that they wanted to work with me. And Mike Shipley, who was Mutt Langer's engineer, was one of the co-producers as well. And I mean, we had a good time for a while, but we sort of saw things differently. And Joni, rightfully gets to call the shots, on her stuff. She'd had collaborators in the past, like Tom Scott or like Jacko. But they played a different instrument from her, so she's not going to tell Tom Scott how to play the sax or Jacko how to play the bass. With me, on the other hand, I'd be programming a synth sound, and she'd come over and like nudge me off the piano stool and sit down and start playing like a piano part with something that was designed for single notes. So we had a bit of a falling out, and I mean, which would have been fine because not all collaborations work out. And then it got sort of unpleasant after that because the album, had its detractors. And I think hardcore Joni fans were disappointed with it, and they needed somebody to blame. And obviously I was the fly in the ointment there. So yeah.
It's not a bad album. I mean, I think with a lot of musicians, especially if you're in for the long haul, and musicians like yourself and like Joni who change over the years, as a fan, you have to expect that things are going to change, and you might not like Mingus, or you might not like Elvis Costello and the Juliet Letters or something. I think you have to give a lot of grace, I think. And so I'm sorry that people gave you flack for that. It's not a bad album. But I really appreciate you kind of diving into that. I'm a huge Joni fan as well.
Yeah. And the same was true of me. My first album after that was Aliens Ate My Buick. And there are people that swear by that album and said, that's when I really sat up and took notice of you. And there are other people that have been into my first two albums that go, oh, you completely lost me, with that. I think it's slightly the cross that we have to bear, those of us that are the restless ones that have to keep reinventing themselves. We can't always be, David Bowie and successfully, shed our skin and move on and just be even more amazing than we were before.
Yeah, it's interesting too with that because people seem to have given Bowie, and maybe I'm wrong because I wasn't, I followed him, later, but they seem to have given him a lot more grace in changing his persona because that was kind of his thing. But other musicians who don't follow the format, of Pump It Up or something, or She Blinded Me with Signs, people seem to freak out. With Aliens Ate My Buick, that is also one of my favorite albums. I got to see you at the Roxy in LA because I grew up in LA and I grew up in the Valley, and you and the Lost Toy People. It was a great show. My Brain Is Like a Sieve is on my perpetual soundtrack. Help Me with a Breakup, which was just fantastic. Well, so with that album, you seem to have gone super funky. I mean, you've always kind of been funky, but I think you worked with George Clinton. Can you kind of talk about that album in a way? Because you got some really good guest musicians on that, and it's got a really good funk to it.
No, thank you. So I moved to LA in 1986. Initially, I was going to just go for a year on the advice of my accountant. But halfway through it, I met Kathleen and fell in love, and I sort of stayed there for a while. And so I decided to form a band and go out and play some shows. And the songs that I wrote with the band in the rehearsal room and then subsequently played in clubs like the Roxy before we ever went in the studio, So we just, I was playing small clubs and wanted to do something a little bit funky and fun and outgoing, kind of a 180 degrees from the more introspective sound of the Flat Earth and Steve McQueen album, which is a Prefab Sprout album. I just wanted to do something more colorful, more extroverted. And so, we came up with those songs in the studio and the grooves for them, and just recorded them pretty much as is, and then replaced bits. And it was interesting because so the engineer producer on that album was Bill Bottrell, and Bill Bottrell, in my opinion, sort of single-handedly changed the sound of music at the end of the 80s because it had gotten very digital, very reverby, very big snare drums. Now you could have sort of 120 tracks of SSL desks with all of these digital reverbs and stuff, all this automated mixing. And Bill wanted to do a complete flip back to sort of realism. So, and I think this is really evident on the Sheryl Crow album, Tuesday Night Music Club, where he literally, put a band in a studio, mic'd everything up, said, just go. And that was the sound that you heard, it was that complete, flip around, pivot from the sound, the typical Trevor Horn, Mutt Lang sort of sound of the 80s. But I think you hear that on songs like Pulp Culture. Sound engineers with big live rigs play that song incessantly still to this day. And I've had sound engineers ask me, how did you get that snare sound, man? I was like, okay, we got a Ludwig, Black Beauty snare. Yeah. So we mic'd it up. Yeah. So I hit it a few times. Yeah. So we just took one of those hits and put it on the backbeat all the way through the album. That was it. Well, I mean, EQ, compression, effect. No.
Wow. Sometimes the simplest things make the most sense.
Yeah.
I guess. And you also, had Robin Leach on there in the opening track, and kind of like, with to go back to the first album too, you had the actual scientist guy on there. So you've liked getting people on your albums that don't necessarily belong on albums. How did you get Robin Leach to do this? Was he like, great, okay, yeah, I'll do this?
Most people, are in central casting catalog, you call their agent and you do a deal and they do it, I mean, so hopefully if they think it's going to be fun, then they're more inclined to do it. Or, I mean, I've been so fortunate. I've had so many people I've asked to be on my albums that didn't want to get paid. They just, they like my music and they'd come and do it. So, Eddie Van Halen's on a couple of songs for my album. I had Garcia and Weir play on one song.
Yeah.
I had Regina Spektor, I had Imogen Heap, Eddie Reader, all these amazing people. And they never want to get paid. And it's like Andy Partridge, same deal. It's just fantastic.
I had no idea about Andy Partridge because I usually am a liner note fanatic in reading that. And I had no idea that he played harmonica on
Yeah, and he also produced Leipzig and Urges for me, which is before I even had a record deal. Yeah, he was kind enough to help me out.
He's another incredible musician in person. We've been talking about you as a musician, but, you're the creative type, as we mentioned, you're an inventor as well. You created Headspace and Beatnik, at a time when digital and were taking off. I ran into you at Moscone Center in San Francisco when you were there for something. I didn't meet you. You walked by and I got giddy. And I was like, oh, there's Thomas Dolby. And I did one of these, like, go say hi. No, don't go say hi. No. So I let you go. I didn't want to bother you. I was there. God, I think I was covering it for something because I'm a reporter too. But anyway, so tell me about Headspace and Beatnik. Like, was this a restless period where you're like, you know what, I'm going to do something different now because you were interested in it?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the 80s, I was working with less exclusive tools like the Fairlight, more mass market tools. Like it was the first time that, Macintoshes and Ataris had MIDI software on them, and you could use those and, start to make records in your back room and so on. Samplers were getting cheaper. Synths and drum machines were everywhere. But what I wanted out of them was different things from what the mass market people wanted. So I would have ideas of ways to use these that maybe they hadn't been intended for. And I was living in LA. A lot of these software companies were in Silicon Valley, and I was able to get in touch with them, largely through events like trade events, like the one you came to at the Moscone Center. And I would sit down with their engineers and pitch my ideas to them of things that I thought were possible. I wouldn't call myself an inventor. I think I'm sort of an early adopter, really. I mean, I'll give you an example. So I worked with this astrophysicist called Fiorella Terenzi, and I did a couple of songs for her. And she's lovely, and brilliant, but she's not a great singer. So I actually had to take her vocal track and retune every single syllable. So I can remember actually going to a software company saying, it's like what I did here was not rocket science, no pun intended, but I was just retuning every single syllable of what she did. Maybe you could come up with like some sort of software or box, that would just do that for me automatically. And that eventually became auto-tune, sorry, right, folks,
Yeah.
But I had nothing to do with inventing auto-tune. I was just somebody that early on saw the possibilities of that technology that existed and saw a new way to use it. And this is, consistent really, really through my career. So anyway, having gone to Silicon Valley and worked with some of these companies, I got a taste for actually creating software from scratch. And it was at a time, the early 90s, when money was pouring into Silicon Valley because of the early days of the internet. And nobody really knew what it was going to be used for, but they knew it was exciting. So there were meat marketing millionaires from Texas would come in and write checks for wacky, startups and things like that. So a lot of money pouring in. And so I thought it was a great opportunity to put together a team of people and come up with some crazy ideas of, technological things to do with audio. And I had a website, an early website, and I'd learned to write HTML, and HTML is the code that glues a web page together. And because of low bandwidth at the time, with the modems that we had, which are very slow, you wouldn't send a big a whopping great, PDF file over the internet, it would take forever to load. You sent little tiny graphics, and HTML was the code that bound them together. And, once those graphics were cached on the user's machine, you didn't need to load them again, right? So I thought, well, okay, MIDI and samples are basically like the same thing. The samples are quite big files, but the MIDI is just the notes and the volumes and the, that glue them together. I thought what we need is like an HTML version of MIDI so that you can create audio web pages that would be efficient the way the visuals are. And nobody had thought of that, right? Did I invent it? No, I developed it, innovated it. It sounded a lot better than streaming audio did in those days because, again, with low bandwidth, you couldn't have Spotify. You could, had really crunchy, horrible audio in those days. And I envisioned, bringing the web alive with music, having these musical web pages or sonic web pages that would essentially generate a soundtrack as you moved around. And that was what I got people to fund, basically, that idea right there. So, it was popular. We had millions and millions of downloads, the Beatnik plugin. We would get some websites to bite off on the idea of sonifying their pages and so on. We had some pretty big deals with people like, Sun Microsystems put it in Java, set-top TV boxes like Web TV, had it in the little Danger device, like a pre-iPhone smartphone, had our sound in and things like that. But none of it made a lot of business sense, and I'm not really a business person anyway. So at the end of the 90s, Beatnik probably would have gone up in smoke like so many other little startups that had brilliant ideas and no revenue. Were it not for one single deal we had that actually had some teeth, and that was with Nokia. And Nokia wanted to put polyphonic ringtones on their phones. They were already like the world's leading cell phone company. They had like 40% of the world market. But they were feeling threatened by Asian phones that had ringtones on them. But they didn't want to put an audio chip in each phone. It would have been expensive and it would have been a liability. So they came to Beatnik and they said, look, you've got an ultra efficient synthesizer. It was ultra efficient because of download speeds. It was very compact, very efficient. And they said, could you put that in our phones? And they only had a weedy little CPU in the phones, but we were able to get like a 4-voice polyphonic ringtone engine working in their phones. And so from about 1998 onwards, every Nokia phone that went out had the Beatnik engine in it. This finally was, potentially a good business for Beatnik. So we basically laid off anybody that was not related to the cell phone part. We pivoted, as they now say. Yeah. And after that, the competitors lined up as well. So we did well for a while, but it was a limited window because by about the mid 2000s, everybody had more powerful phones that could play MP3 files. So now, for your ringtone, you could have an actual Beyonce clip or whatever, rather than a bleepy ringtone. So that window closed rather quickly. And to be honest, I was kind of relieved. Fiduciary responsibility is not really my bag. I felt trapped by this. And so I was sort of relieved when that ended.
Yeah. Well, to parlay on the word pivot, which I don't like, but I have to use sometimes. What do you think now of streaming? I mean, you have those downloads from Nokia, and MTV was kind of a way to get music. What do you think of the streaming world now for musicians? Do you think it's a good way for people to maybe rediscover you, or, I mean, it is what it is. So what are your thoughts on the streaming world?
Yeah, I mean, often technological innovation outstrips copyright law, outstrips legislation, often outstrips the music industry because they get very entrenched with their way of doing things. It's like, midway through the 90s, record companies still thought that marketing was about you buy the back page of Billboard magazine and you just like hope you can, sell lots of millions out of this album because the last one did pretty good. Maybe we can be quadruple plat. It was just sort of very entrenched old world way of doing things. And they were young kids coming in more from the tech side that were like day traders. They were surrounded by monitors. They were into social media. They were looking into algorithms and things like that. And streaming improved to the point where you could get, average people could get real-time, music on their devices, on their phones, and so on. And technologies just sort of went, just blazing ahead of the industry and the law and being able to catch up with it. And it's been that way ever since the printing press. I mean, the Statute of Anne in 1760, whatever it, jukeboxes, piano rolls, radio, cable TV. It always, the technology is ahead of the lawmakers. And then plus, lawmakers are funded by big corporations, by Disney and Viacom and Warner's, who, those corporations will survive longer than you or me, right? And then they have no brain or consciousness like we do. But those are the ones those are the only ones that are really steering, lawmaking in Washington or elsewhere in the world. So it's always been a mess. It's always been a complete mess. And it's great for consumers, because today you can get basically all the music in the world and everything that's ever been created, you can get for free, or if you put up with the ads, you can get it for free, or like for a few bucks a month, you can get access to everything. So it's a very different landscape from when you and I were kids, where music was precious, it was rare. We would save up to buy an album, we'd pore over the words and the credits, and we'd read interviews about them and hope they were coming to town, so we'd go see them live. It's a very, very different environment. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. I think it's progress. It is what it is. Now you've got AI coming on the scene, where your playlist on Spotify might be populated by AI generated music that seems to the algorithm matches to your previous tastes. As consumers, we're sort of being manipulated in that way, and it's a scary time on a certain level. But my reaction to new technologies has always been the glass half full thing. It's always, well, what can I do with this creatively? To stand apart from the crowd and do something unexpected and show the world like a positive, artistic way of using these technologies that you hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, I'm hoping that with downloads, that it leads people to actually go explore music. Like if they hear one of your songs, like, I want to hear more from them, and instead of looking on Spotify, go get a physical album. I know people are buying albums. I know I was just at a record store the other day with like getting used records, and they asked me, I mentioned that I have cassette tapes. Like, you do? Because kids are buying cassette tapes. And I was like, okay, we'll see. I might hold on to mine. I just hope people investigate a little bit more. So in the little bit of time we have left, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about turning again to another creative endeavor of you becoming an author with Prevail. I can't even. You could say the title, because I'm poor at announcing things. Apparently, I'm fascinated by this novel. One, because I love historical fiction. Eric Larson, Candace Millard, two of my favorites, where they take actual events and tell a story with it. How did you want to do this?
Well, I'd written a memoir before, The Speed of Sound, and that was pretty straightforward, relatively straightforward, because I was basically writing down stories that I'd told verbally, in one form or another. But I enjoyed the process. I found it quite relaxing. And I thought, well, I'll have a go at a novel. I've always been a very keen sailor. I'm a big fan of old wooden sailboats, particularly the peak of the America's Cup era, which is, sort of prior to the World Wars, when many of the giant yachts were owned by robber barons and sort of rich financiers and heirs to railroad fortunes and things. And there were these magnificent racing machines that were manned by poor sailors from Maine and from the east coast of England. I mean, a lot of these big sailboats took 35, 40 men to sail them.
That's incredible.
And these millionaires, members of the New York Yacht Club, would basically wager huge sums. And in the turn of the century, it was a huge spectator sport, bigger than boxing, bigger than baseball or football. Horse racing perhaps was comparable, but it was front page news, in the New York Times, if there was an America's Cup race going on in the harbor. So, I loved that as a backdrop for the story. I felt that historically, those early 20th century years were sort of underexplored really in fiction and in film. The Gilded Age, yes. The World Wars, yes, but that sort of pre-World War period, not so much. But it was a fascinating period with what was going on with, a lot of sort of labor issues with, the triangle shirt fire, factory fire, with the slaughter by a militia, private militia of like mine workers in Colorado, women's rights, suffragette movement, all of these, really interesting unionization, all these amazing things going on, and millions of immigrants pouring into America and often living in tenement slums. Conversely, the top elite of the New York Yacht Club, collectively had more power and wealth than the U.S. Treasury and government, and they paid no income tax. Certain parallels to, things that have been going on recently. I don't know
It sounds familiar, kind
I
of.
don't know what we're allowed to say on NPR. It's like, you guys are the enemies of the people, of course. So I just found that a fascinating period, and the actual, the technology of the sailboats, and the strategy of the racing, and this ongoing vendetta between the Brits and the Americans, because you guys won the cup in 1851 and we never got it back, and that's never stopped upsetting us.
Well, it's I can't say the word prevail. It's like cellular. I have a hard time saying cellular. It's prevailing wind, right? Which I am putting it on my list to get because I love books like that right now. Before I let you go, I know we have a couple more minutes still. I'm interested in your thoughts of, there are certain bands from the heyday of the 80s, which you can't escape. The Cure released a fantastic album. Depeche Mode is touring. What is next for you? You're a professor right now, as you mentioned. Are you dabbling still with maybe another album in the works? Like, what's next on your list?
The concept of doing an album seems a little bit sort of staid and passé somehow. I think it'll have to be something that is a new creative challenge for me. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm just sort of at my best really when I don't really know what the heck I'm doing. So I don't know what it's going to be. I've enjoyed teaching the last 10 years in Baltimore. Doing film music and the kind of music that I do, I never really stopped to think about how I do it until I've had to teach it to students. And Peabody is a conservatory. They've got, conventional professors that can teach them theory and sight reading and orchestration, things like that. But I bring them something a little bit different, which is sort of real world experience, applying my musical chops to, whatever is the new thing on the horizon. And when they're out in the workforce, it's going to be something unimaginable, to me today, long after I've gone. But I'm trying to give them the tools that they need to succeed, and the sort of resourceful creativity with minimal, with minimal ingredients to create something special. Even though for today's generation, they tend to feel that the instant solution to everything is just a few key presses away, and now with AI, you can just have ChatGPT do it for you. Yes, but how are you going to set yourself apart from 10,000 other guys that hit the same buttons you did? That's really the question. So I've enjoyed the teaching. I need at some point to get back to being just my own boss and being creative for myself. And I'm not getting any younger. So, I don't know what it's going to be, but for now, I'm just enjoying life.
Yeah. And you've gone out on tour a little bit. I noticed too, you were playing with the Thompson Twins, and doing some festivals. How has that been?
Well, I did a big 80s tour in the summer, for sort of 4,000 or 5,000 seat auditoriums, and it was fun as hell. I mean, it was really great. There were a lot of my contemporaries from the 80s. I was one of the only acts with all of the original members.
Wow.
Just me, in other words.
Yeah. That's how dumb I'm like, oh, and I'm like, yeah, it's you. Sorry.
So they flatteringly, invited me to top the bill, which I thought was, was kind of crazy. But as it turns out, it's like 40, 50, 60-year-olds after a day's drinking and listening to hits from their youth, they were sort of losing steam somewhat by the end of the night. But it was a great time. And, it wasn't a Dolby audience. It was sort of an 80s audience. So other than 3 or 4 of my better known songs, I wasn't going to force them to endure my new songs or my deep cuts from my albums or anything at that time of night. So I actually threw in some covers of other iconic moments from the 80s. And I would quote from other people, such as even The Cure. I sang a line from a Love Song over the end of one of our submarines. I do a cover of David Bowie's Heroes, where I'm projecting sort of an ambient cover, and I'm projecting behind me my photos and video from the day that I flew into Live Aid at Wembley Stadium with Bowie in a helicopter. And I sort of tell that story, and it's very personal. And then I have samples of Bowie's vocals on buttons, so I can just trigger his vocals at random while I'm playing. So I sort of presented myself as kind of a curator, a bit of an ambassador for the 80s, a bit like a Questlove today, or a Quincy Jones in a previous generation, and that's a role that sort of feels quite comfortable for me.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of these tours too are sort of set up as nostalgia, but in a way they're not, especially with some of the bands that are still playing. It's just musicians are musicians, and this is what you do. So I think it's great that you're doing this, and I feel remiss or sad that I didn't get to go see you, and I hope you play somewhere. I'm down in Richmond, so I hope you play in Richmond.
Yeah, I mean,
Thomas Dolby, I want to go ahead.
It's a delicate balance, really, because a lot of my contemporaries, you don't see Depeche Mode or Duran or The Cure on those nostalgia bills, and so I don't want to just pigeon myself in the where are they now file. But the flip side is, I can't get 5,000 people to come and see me play in a club, but I could maybe go from a club to a theater if a number of those 5,000 look out for my solo show next time I come through Richmond, Virginia. So that there's a balance to be struck.
Yeah. Well, Thomas Dolby, I've just been so fascinated by our conversation and so happy that you took time to talk to us today. On full disclosure, I really, really want to thank you for being our guest today.
Nice to be here.
Special thanks to Roben Farzad for giving me the reins to interview Thomas Dolby. Both Roben and I are huge fans. Make sure you check out Roben's conversation with Virginia gubernatorial candidate Abigail Spanberger and others. You can follow Full Disclosure on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky. And be sure to catch Roben on CNN and NPR's Here and Now. Roben will be back with you next week. I'm Ian Stewart. Thanks for checking this out.